Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Comrades, a podcast discussing current events, theory, and action through a radical lens. What's up, y'all? Pearson here, back at it again with another edition of Coffee with Comrades, and boy am I excited for this one. I recently got the chance to sit down with my friends in ABC with Danny and Jim for a collaborative episode to interview Ruth Kinna about her book, The Government of No One. The resulting discussion was an absolute blast, and I can't wait to share it with you all. But first, a couple quick announcements. As always, Coffee with Comrades is a proud member of the Rev Left Radio Federation and the Channel Zero Network. Make sure you go check out this month's CZN Spotlight of the Month, Dissident Island Radio.
You're listening to Dissident Island Radio.
Live every first and third Friday of the month at 9 p.m. GMT.
Check out www.dissidentisland.org for downloads and more.
We recently sent out a fresh round of Coffee with Comrades stickers to newly subscribed Patreon members. So if you subscribe to the podcast in the last 3 months or so, keep an eye out on your mailbox. If you haven't done so already, you can support this independent media project by going to www.patreon.com/Coffee with Comrades. For as little as $1 a month, you can get exclusive first access, bonus content, unlock the Coffee with Comrades Discord server, and enjoy a whole host of other perks. Speaking of which, the next issue of our bi-monthly zine, Cold Brew Chronicles, will be dropping at the end of the month, so keep an eye out for that as well. Before we get to today's edition of the program, I should also note 2 things real quick. First, you might notice Danny from way back in episode 75, when he came on the show to chat about his book regarding the Spanish Civil War. Ruth has also visited Coffee with Comrades in the past, back on episode 99. So if you haven't listened to either of those episodes and you dig this one, definitely check those out as well. We'll include links to both in our show notes. For now, pour yourself a cup of coffee, sit back, relax, and enjoy episode 113 of Coffee with Comrades. Anarchize everything.
Some call it karma, some call it fate. Laws of attraction take on new weight. I sit in silence and hope for change. Reckless abandon of what we take for granted. No escape, no future, no luck lost on a loser. No escape, no future. We're heading for the brick
So I thought, a good way to kind of start would just be to kind of go around in a circle, give our names, our pronouns, our academic or activist affiliations, and either for Jim and Danny and I, the shows that we host, or for Ruth, the name of the book you wrote. So I'll just go ahead and start. My name is Pearson. I host the podcast Coffee with Comrades. I teach at Florida State University and do a whole bunch of crazy lefty stuff in the community. That's me.
So my name is Ruth. I work at Loughborough University in the UK, and I've recently published The Government of No One. And I'm a member at Loughborough of the Anarchism Research Group, which does a lot of really interesting stuff. And I've been there since 1992.
I'm Danny Evans. I'm the Danny from ABC with Danny and Jim. I teach history at a university in Liverpool, and my pronouns are he, him.
Hi, I'm Jim Yeoman, he, him. Also based in Liverpool, but not currently affiliated to university. Formerly of University of Sheffield, and the book that I published last year is called Print Culture and the Formation of the Anarchist Movement in Spain.
All right, cool. Well, today we're going to go around and kind of ask Ruth a bunch of questions about her new book, The Government of No One. And I think, Danny, you were up in the first slot, my guy, so why don't you start us off?
Okay, Ruth. So perhaps this was a general introductory question. Could you explain why you were attracted to the project of writing this book and how your book differs from other introductions to anarchism?
So the book came about because I was approached. So I was approached by Pelican, and what's not to like about that? I was just bowled over, if you like, by the opportunity. And I suppose part of me, always thinks that whenever I finish a project or a piece of work, my first reaction is to think, oh, thank goodness that's over. And my second reaction is to tend to think, what would I have done differently? If I got to do this again, what would I do differently? And because I had written an introduction to anarchism a few years back, it is something I think about quite a lot. And I've thought about since publishing this as well, what would I do differently? So it was just too good an opportunity to miss. And it was something I like explaining anarchism. I think basically that's one of the things I like doing. I like promoting anarchist ideas, and this was a fantastic chance to do that. In terms of what I wanted to do in the book, I didn't actually set out to try and do something entirely new. There were things that I did want to do, I suppose. One of the things I wanted to do was to try and make the anarchist critique intelligible to people who would be naturally skeptical, perhaps to an audience who wouldn't otherwise pick up a book on anarchism, but who might pick up a Penguin. I wanted to make the critique intelligible without compromising on its depth or its scope or its radicalism, if you like. So that's one of the things I wanted to do. I wanted to change the dynamic of the debate about violence. So although I kind of signal in the opening that I'm aware of the kind of the branding issue that anarchists have, that they're associated with these, they have these kind of images that attach to them as fanatics, terrorists, irrational, all of these kinds of stereotypes. I didn't want to start the discussion with that. So I wanted to recognize that there was violence that's integral to the story of anarchism, but to think about that from a different point of view. So actually, violence gets introduced into the story through an account of repression. And then by the time we get to the so-called terrorism, actually, there's a different context in which that's discussed. So I wanted to challenge those kinds of debates. I wanted to muddy distinctions that are made between anarchist schools. So, the primary distinction being between individualists and communists. And I wanted to suggest that although this is an important distinction, it's certainly important historically, and it's still important, I think, actually, that it's easily overplayed, and that there's much more that's going on in the relationship between anarchists than you might otherwise be led to believe. And I also wanted to maybe put people in different kinds of alignment. So at one point in the book, I put Bakunin next to Tolstoy and suggest actually that there's a conversation to be had between them, that the critique of political theology doesn't rule out a religious sensibility, that these are not tensions and contradictions that make anarchism into an incoherent mess. They're just different ways of thinking about the same problem, and people come up with different responses and solutions to that. And I wanted to I wanted to think about the relationships between people who are obviously anarchists, who define themselves as anarchists, or who are so closely associated with anarchist traditions, and maybe people who are less obviously associated with anarchism, but where I think there are alignments and conversations to be had. And finally, I wanted to tell some stories about the individuals who I think make up this tradition. There's a hefty section at the back of the book which basically covers a whole set of biographies of my cast of characters, if you like. And I mean, it's risky in a way because you always end up excluding some people who deserve to be mentioned and talked about. But I at least wanted to give readers a flavour of the lives that had been led, and the contributions that individuals made, and the fantastically rich contributions that individuals made to this tradition.
Beautiful. Well, I, for one, have like a million questions, and we're probably not going to get to all of them, but I did want to ask you, because you have this like really lengthy and wonderful section about the efficacy of education in your book, Ruth, which really appealed to me as a professor, and I think is part of like kind of the conversations that a lot of us, hosting this podcast have with one another and with our colleagues all the time, right? Is like, how can we be good educators, right? And I think, even the podcasts that we both host are doing a lot of educational work. And so it's one of the things that appealed to me, and I wanted to ask you about, because it really gels with my sort of pedagogical approach to teaching. And in The Government of No One, you have this really useful figure, which is 2.1 for folks who have the book, which outlines the differences that distinguish anarchist education from statist education. And I thought it was useful that you used anarchist education and statist education rather than like leftist education. Like there's the distinction, right, between like a very specific type of libertarian type of education and statist education. And so I was wondering if you could maybe walk us briefly through the different ways that anarchists and statists approach the conception, management, method, and aims of education.
I can try. So it is a long section on education, and it's a long section because it mirrors the previous discussion. So the previous chapter is all about domination. And what I try and do in the previous chapter is think about the different ways in which anarchists have understood problems of domination. And these are multiple. And there's no silver bullet to anarchy. There are just multiple forms of domination that anarchists are wrestling with all of the time. Both externally, if you like, in terms of the hierarchies that exist, but also internally in terms of the social context that they inhabit themselves. So domination is the problem that I set up, and education is introduced as a way of thinking about, well, how do you deal with that? And part of the discussion is sort of turns, I suppose, on a relationship that I'm trying to build between anarchism as a critique of republicanism. And if you think about it in those ways, then one of the things that anarchists inherit from republicanism is the idea of how you create and sustain the virtuous republic. And you do that by nurturing virtuous and creative and participatory citizens, right? Well, the anarchist doesn't want to sustain the republic. The anarchist wants to keep building anarchy. But it's the same problem. If you know that domination exists, if you can locate it in particular kinds of hierarchy, then there are ways in which you can structurally change. But you still have this problem of always being aware of the possibility that some people may try and exercise power over others, command authority over others, not understand the hierarchies they're in, all of these problems. So this is a problem of education. It's a problem that anarchists try and deal with, I think, in the round in terms of socializing people. The question is, how do you socialize people to exercise individual judgment cooperatively and in ways that don't dominate others and in ways that aren't repressive? And that's essentially a problem of educating. And you can do it in multiple ways. You can do it by drawing people's attention to the powers that currently dominate. You can do it by persuasion. You can do it through dramatic actions. You can do it in all kinds of ways. You can do it through propaganda in multiple forms. But it is about education. So that's one way in which I sort of introduce, if you like, the idea of education. And once so the question that then raises itself for me is, well, so how do you close the gap between an aspiration to educate people so that they can operate, that they can be empowered to function anarchistically in a society that is dominating? So there's forever this tension about how you do that. And the one thing that that anarchists can't do is that they can't tell people, they can't command people to be anarchists. They can't give them a book. They can't just sort of say, these are the 10 things that you need to know in order to be anarchist.
This is the party line or whatever.
Exactly. So education necessarily has to be a constant process in which everybody is trying to learn from each other to live in ways that are non-dominating. And that suggests, I think, a particular kind of pedagogy. So the way that discussion attempts to roll out is from the kind of the general problem of socialization and how you build or what it is you're trying to do through education, and then the smaller but no less significant problem of the institutions and the methods that you use, that you necessarily have to use in order to fulfill the ends that you want to achieve. And those ends are non-dominating. And that, of course, sets up a problem of instruction and guidance and overcoming a power relationship, which we always confront whenever we try and educate anybody about anything. And I think in anarchism, one of the things I'm trying to say is that if you're aware of the gap, if you're aware of that potential problem, then you can always use the power relationships that could potentially become really damaging in more constructive ways. And that, I think, is what anarchists try and do. And so the end of the chapter tries to show in practical ways the kinds of experiments that anarchists have entered into precisely in order to build confidence about anarchism, to lay out the principles and to encourage people to become anarchistic in their practices without the use of command.
Right, not forcing you, but encouraging. It's like the difference when your mom or dad is like, "Hey, I'm not telling you to do this thing."
That's right.
Really, I'm encouraging you. I'm inviting you to do this thing.
So, and this is the problem that so people like Tolstoy, who set up schools, were constantly wrestling with this. One of the things that the things that really troubled him was that he was a great lover of Beethoven and high art, if you like, but also respected the folk art of the kids that he was trying to educate. So one of the problems he has is, he starts off with the idea that children will just come to Beethoven if you let them develop in their own ways, and then he realizes that they don't. So how do you introduce them to something that you think is good without imposing your own value system in a way that crushes everything else in them? And I think that that's the problem that in a specific way that the anarchist is trying to deal with, and that means that education must be fundamentally different from the way it works in the state, because in the state you're being trained up to do something always, and trained up to fit some model of practice that's been determined for you, and that's it means you have completely different methods of educating people, completely different aims, completely different objectives. It's a world of difference between the two.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ruth. That really kind of chimes a lot with many of the examples that I found in Spain around the turn of the century, where I agree with you in a way that education really is the kind of master framework that they're trying to operate in. They see everything they're doing as educative, and they have these these kind of wrestles, as you put it, like Francisco Ferrer, always occurs in discussions of anarchist education, but he was having the exact same, debates within the movement, others in the movement saying, no, this is dominating, this is elitist, this is, this is telling people what to do. And he kind of sometimes was a bit like, well, what do you want me to do? But it's a constant thing. And I think that this kind of focusing in on education kind of ties back to the first question in your answer there about trying to reframe anarchism. And I think that a lot of these thoughts about education are something that would resonate with many people now about the relationship of power within education. And I think focusing on that and kind of pulling out that and making, for example, violence a kind of a part of that, but it's definitely not the whole story, is really adding to what you're doing with the book. And I think this ties into a question that I have about, as anyone working on anarchist history or theory knows, you do often encounter the persistent claims from people who aren't anarchists that it is deviant, that it is dangerous, or I like the quote that you put in by Zenker, that it's a hallmarked by a childlike catastrophism. I know it's a massive question, but why do you think that it has this purchase? Like one idea I sort of throw out is, perhaps because, as you say, of anarchism's emphasis on doing and on deeds and on, kind of getting involved and not having these kind of sacred, canonical texts, as in contrast to, say, the very scientific, in kind of inverted commas, theorizing that's so embedded in the Marxist tradition. That was just one idea. I wondered if you had any others about why it is that the anarchist bomb thrower, uncontrollable, remains so domineering in the discussion of the.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a sense, the anarchists have only got themselves to blame. I mean, if you call yourself an anarchist when you know that the word means chaos, then you're working, you're putting yourself on the back foot in a way, but at the same time, I think, the reason that someone like Proudhon calls himself an anarchist is because he wants to make clear that he doesn't see himself, he doesn't see his politics within the framework, the ideological framework of post-revolutionary Europe. So where you have a breakdown between conservatives, liberals, and then as the century goes on, socialists. Anarchy is not on that spectrum. It's out of that spectrum, and you have to understand that, I think, and that's why Proudhon has this kind of provocative, or he adopts this provocative label, but because it's bound to be scary, but I think that message comes through quite loud and clear. So I'm not sure that it's the emphasis on deeds as such. I think that comes. The stories I tell at the beginning of the book about Haymarket and the Paris Commune. These are important events, but the demonization that takes place precedes any of the big, waves of assassination that come in Europe in the 1890s to the early century. This is the reputation that the anarchist has is acquired, through a fear, I think, that these are socialists at the point at which the First International breaks down. The commentators who are looking at that are looking at the relationships between these two wings of a socialist movement, which nobody really understands. But they do pick up on the fact that, well, there is an aspiration in part of this socialist movement to take part in parliamentary institutions, and that makes them look good. So it may be a complete distortion of Marxism to say that they were reformist, but it looks like they're joining. It looks like they're at least having a conversation about these institutions. The anarchists are saying, I don't want anything to do with this. I'm going to work outside. And of course, that's immediately a problem, and that's exactly what the anarchists do. They mobilize in union movements, they mobilize in their own smaller groups, and they're attacking all of the institutions that are being defended as perfect expressions of liberty and equality. how much worse could it be? I think there's also a kind of a historical accident, if you like, that some of the anarchists who are coming out of Russia, so some of the big names in anarchism, it forges a link with nihilism. The nihilists have just killed the Tsar. There's a lot of women involved, and not only are they killing people, they're also not getting married. This is appalling kind of transgressive behavior, because if you start attacking institutions like the family, goodness knows where are we going to end up? So I think you can see why anarchism presses these kinds of buttons of destructiveness and social chaos, because actually that is what the anarchists want to do. They do want to transgress. They don't want to obey the rules. They're not accepting the norms, and they're and they're associated as well with anti-state struggle. And then you've got the chaos label. So anyone who then seems to sort of, or any movement that falls into this category is always going to be anarchist, whatever the politics that's being expressed. Which is why, from the 1780s, any kind of assassination attempt is being labelled anarchist. So that the attempts on the Kaiser, they're anarchist, even though from the anarchist point of view, of course, they're not. So it's that kind of general confusion, I think, that explains the demonization. And I think the reputation that Marxists gain for being scientific, that's another complication, but I think that comes a bit later. Marx is known from the manifesto and in 1871 as being a fairly threatening character. He's the Red Doctor, right? So that tendency, if you like, to think of Marxism as a theory and anarchism as a practice, I think that comes later.
Yeah, I think that's really convincing, Ruth. Just now that the sort of anarchist Marxist divergence has been introduced, it's made me think about the educational question, and this is like sort of deviating from the script a bit. But
that's where things get interesting, Danny. Let's deviate.
Well, it just occurs to me that, especially thinking about the anarchist movements that Jim and I in particular sort of look at in Spain, like education, yes, is this like kind of framework, the master framework, if you like, for understanding their activity. But just on the face of it, without like getting into the sort of anarchistic techniques of performing that educational work, the idea that there are some people, anarchists in this case, who have arrived at the truthful position, who have understood how domination operates in society, and then need to persuade the masses, right, of that truth, is, on the face of it, broadly similar to, say, the sort of Leninist conception of consciousness needing to be introduced to the working classes from the outside. And it just occurs to me that, what I would wonder what you think, like about, say, Rosa Luxemburg's critique of Lenin in this sort of period of the early 20th century, to basically sort of try and subvert that whole model, right, of saying that, in fact, it's us who are likely to learn from the masses, right, from the struggle. Like that process itself is what's going to have like an educative quality. And if you think about, the Paris Commune has already been talked about. If you think about like the Paris Commune itself as something that doesn't like emerge as a consequence of propaganda, although maybe that's a sort of more complicated question. But has this enormous sort of generative role in both Marxist, but definitely specifically anarchist conceptualizing of revolutionary transformation in the future. So I wonder, what you think about the Luxemburg's critique, and would you claim that critique as a libertarian critique, and would you agree that in some ways it's like a more profound subversion of the educational model, because it goes beyond like just a technique of trying to sort of mitigate domination?
So there's a lot there. So one difference I think between anarchists and Marxists is all that. I mean, given that there's huge variety as well within Marxism, but you don't get the same. There's no role for. There's a very different understanding of class and what class does, or what the function of class is. And for me, I mean, I do write about or try and sort of talk about different ways that anarchists have understood class. But however they've written about it and however close some of the discourses to discourses in Marxism, I don't think anarchists, typically at least, consider that change comes through understanding a particular social role. It's not about constituting yourself. It's about how you behave. So it is about practices. It's not about sort of delivering liberation. And that makes revolutionary change different in these traditions for me. In terms of I think, on the kind of the Kautsky-Lenin, the gap between the problem of consciousness, if you like, and working class consciousness, and how you overcome misunderstanding, or how you instruct people or how you draw people's attention to the fact that they may be exploited, they may be oppressed, and they don't realize it. How do you do that? Well, it's not quite the same problem, because you're not trying to create class consciousness, but what you are trying to do, and I think this is really clear in people like Malatesta, you are aware of the fact that people are manipulated, and they're deferential, and they're misled, and they're frightened, and they're likely to believe the people that they're told they should believe. So there are, dominant structures which inhibit people from taking part in revolutionary movements, in expressing themselves in ways that anarchists want them to express themselves through resistance. So there is that gap. But I think Malatesta's pretty clear that you can only keep trying to show what the problem is and persuade people. And if they don't join resistance movements, then this is a matter of strategy and waiting and organizing. It's not a matter of developing the right consciousness in order to achieve revolution at a time that somebody else understands is correct. I think that these are fundamentally different ways of looking at revolution, and historical forces and change. I mean, in terms of, is Rosa Luxemburg libertarian? I think there are aspects of Rosa Luxemburg which are libertarian, but she's also a determinist. I mean, she's an economic determinist. So, I think those critiques make sense within the framework of the debates that are going on within social democracy at the time. And I think they're important debates. And I think there are conversations to be had always across libertarian traditions. But I don't think that the starting points are the same. I think they are different.
Okay.
In other words, I do think that, I think there's a temptation often to think that anarchists don't have a distinctive kind of way of theorizing, but I think they do. And I think that comes through the critique of domination, and not just, if we call this the state, then we can get misled, because the state is a concept that appears across socialist traditions. But I think the critique of domination actually is distinctive in anarchism.
I'll follow that, that big question there, and where we ended on domination, with, I guess, one way that anarchists have kind of conceived and articulated domination. And when I was reading, I just really picked up on, it's unfair to focus on one line, I suppose, but I was interested in kind of exploring it, because on our podcast we've talked about quite a few works on slavery, the experience of slavery, emancipation, the self-emancipation of blacks in the United States, and kind of that kind of world anyway. We've looked at Paul Gilroy, David Rodinger's work and Julius S. Scott. So, it's something that we obviously have an interest in, and the line that you made the point that despite the very frequent invocations of slavery in 19th century anarchist writing in particular, but beyond that as well, you say that they are not making a moral equivalence between chattel and wage slavery, that there is something distinct in that. And I wondered what that distinction was, because again, it's something I encounter quite a lot, and is in the book quite a lot. There's Lure's quote that government is organised slavery, and that kind of made me think, like, okay, so what is there a different kind of understanding of slavery then than the one that I guess most people now would think of chattel slavery, and if there is that, could you kind of develop on it?
I think anarchists recognise, or the people I'm talking about, I mean, certainly people like Kropotkin, but not just Kropotkin, recognised that there was a difference in the status that people had once chattel slavery was abolished. So the acknowledgement of rights, even if you couldn't enjoy them, still made a difference. You had fundamentally different status. And there's something that Kropotkin says at some point in Words of a Rebel, that you can't whip people on the streets in Paris like you can in Odessa, because people have rights. You simply can't do it. You could have done it, 50 years ago, before the revolution or whatever, or 100 years ago, but you can't do it now. So it makes a fundamental difference. But having said that, I think anarchists were serious that the brutality that you find in the worst forms of chattel slavery could be replicated even after the abolition, and are. I think they were serious that the violence that's involved in contract, where people have rights and they can choose, effectively what they do, and they can have legal protections and all the rest of it. But there's nevertheless, there is a violence which can be as harsh, that the compulsion remains, and that the basic relationship between master and slave is replicated even in a regime of rights. So there are differences. There are clearly differences in the status of a chattel slave and a wage worker, a wage slave. But there is a fundamental continuity as well. And so when Tolstoy says in The Slavery of Our Times, he kind of asked the question, what's the difference? In the old days, the landowner could compel the serf to go down into the cesspit and clean it out. And now the landowner can't do that because the serfs have been freed. But nevertheless, the landowner has the power to pay one of 100 serfs, former serfs, to go and do this on a contractual basis. Not much changed, but there's not the same. The fact that rights have been asserted, of course, makes a difference.
Well, that's interesting, because it really echoes a point that's made very early in David Rodinger's book about seizing freedom, in which he says, despite all of the, continuing violence and oppression post self-emancipation of slaves, that there is still a difference in the situation between those 2 points, and I think that would kind of carry on there. So it's an interesting point, and thanks for your answer.
But I mean, Lucy Parsons, it says, words to the effect, we came out of the Civil War having fought in order to abolish slavery. That was for her, that was what the Civil War was about in America. And her position in 1887 is that they were sold a lie.
Yeah, that's pretty damning, especially coming from Lucy Parsons. Ruth, one of the recurrent themes that I noticed throughout The Government of No One is how you place different tensions in anarchist theory and praxis around these separate poles. And you talked about this at the very beginning of this discussion, where you draw distinctions between these different types of trends within anarchism, right? Between social and individualist currents in anarchism, or debates around nonviolence and tactical diversity. And one of the things that has always consistently drawn me to anarchism is its ability to perform these types of nuanced syntheses, right? It's not either or, but it's both and. And so I was curious if you think that anarchism offers a useful framework for this sort of dialectical critical inquiry, and what it is about anarchist theory and praxis that maybe lends itself to this sort of analysis and inquiry.
That's that's interesting. So I suppose, I mean, one of the things I was trying to do when in the discussion of organization and individualism and all of that was to try and suggest that the classic mappings between individualists as people who reject violence and hate organization, and the social anarchists or the communists as people who, are ready at the drop of a hat to build a barricade and, will dragoon people into all kinds of potentially rigid sort of organizational structures. This is a parody, and there are overlaps, and there are, as you say, there are tensions, and that's the point, because for me, these arguments about, how we should strategize or how we should respond to domination. This is an issue of context, and it's an issue of judgment fundamentally, and responsibility. So, people make decisions. Clearly, there can be principled divisions between people about, certainly on questions of violence. But in the main, it seems to me that one of the really rich things about anarchism is this ongoing discussion, if you like, about what we can learn from particular people in particular times, and how that informs our current practices and responses to problems, and most of all for me, how we can resist being too judgmental about the choices that other people have made, because we have to walk a mile in other people's shoes. We have to try and imagine ourselves in those contexts, and have a bit of humility, if you like, about the choices that people have made and the decisions that people take. And I think that argument and that debate must continue. And I think anarchists miss a trick if really complex decisions about organization and strategy become too programmatic. That this is the way that you do something. I just think that's probably a recipe for disaster. If people have to evaluate the context in which they're in and make decisions on that basis in cooperation with others. That's where I want it to go.
Yeah, that fluidity is really, really appealing, and it makes it, I think, it makes it a really dynamic philosophy for approaching all sorts of different issues in life, whether it's education, like we were talking about, whether it's state oppression, whether it's personal relationships, like in the family or like romantic relationships. It's all subject for critique and analysis because of the fluidity and the dynamism of anarchy, which I think is neat.
Emma Goldman is that she's constantly wrestling with, did she do the right thing? And often saying, "Oh, I don't think I did." But it's open and it's out there and it's for everyone to see. And, you can only learn from that.
Something that I wanted to ask, that you've already kind of touched upon it, and I just, perhaps want to just expand a bit more. I found the discussion of anarchist attitudes towards law really interesting, and not really something that comes up a great deal, I don't think, in that kind of way you've approached it. And anarchist attitudes to, say, the Enlightenment and the notion of modernity, I find very interesting. And, I've encountered a few times recently this notion of a kind of alternative modernity or an anarchist modernity, and I think that's a really kind of that's something that I'd like to kind of explore more in this relationship. Not least because, I'm familiar in the Spanish context of anarchism being seemingly forever framed by Eric Hobsbawm as a kind of primitive, pre-modern sort of way of thinking of the world. But this is clearly something that, as you said earlier, it is slightly out of the spectrum in a way of kind of European or world global kind of thought, post French Revolution. But at the same time, it clearly does use a kind of Enlightenment modernity mentality to some extent. The concepts and the subjects of anarchism are often the same that other movements are using, but they've been kind of reframed in a way that doesn't click into very easily a kind of liberal or Marxist teleology. And I wonder if this, if you feel, and you kind of suggested already, so maybe the answer is just yes, but if this is, this is a cut between anarchism and other kind of groups on the left or liberals, or these kind of things, that goes deeper than often how it's framed, which is the distinction is between strategy. You'll find in accounts of the First International that really the only difference between them is how they achieve the same ends. This suggests actually no, that this is something, kind of fundamentally different between the two, and I wondered if you had anything more to say on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fundamentally different to everybody, actually. So, the anarchists sort of argue basically that the state is a historic defeat. So in that sense, they're kind of part of everything that you could associate with modernity, in the sense that they anticipate people like Weber and say, but this is all wrong. This is what we should resist. All of these forces, these are our detriment. This is our doom. The last words that Kropotkin says at the end of the state, its historic role, is, you've got a choice. It's life and mutual aid, or it's the state and death. And he's not far wrong. And what he's looking at, and not just Kropotkin, but I think, you find the same kinds of themes in Bakunin, in most of Bakunin's followers, so Reclus, Malatesta, all of these people, they're looking round at their, their local environments, if you like, and they're seeing forms of life and practices, ways of living, social orders, which are not pre-state in the sense that they're destined to be developed or overcome. These have evolved over time, and they're perfectly capable of evolving again and of adapting and developing and becoming, enriched and all of this. But that process will be halted with the extension and the imposition of state structures. That's basically, I think, the argument that, what do you lose if you centralize everything, if you regulate everything, if you demand uniformity, if you impose these ways of living and practices that people themselves become detached from, that you physically move people, from one location to another in order to satisfy some need of the state, that you dragoon them into military service, that, you start regulating people's lives in completely artificial ways, that they're not, that people are, but one of the things that Kropotkin says in mutual aid is, the village community is the most stable social system. It's the one that you find everywhere across the globe. It's existed for the longest period of time. It continues to exist within the state. So, and the point he's making is not that, we should try and preserve something, an aspect, but that we should resist those forces that will crush it, because the costs of that are, social alienation, detachment, and a complete dislocation of individuals from environments that they can participate in and shape themselves. And so from that point of view, of course, from the critical perspective, that looks backward looking, because if you assume that the state is a historic victory, and, the root of all progress and well-being, then of course any kind of critique makes it look as if you're trying to turn the clock back. But the anarchist is saying, that those time frames themselves are completely fictitious. you've just imposed that on the world and said that's what you think because you have this kind of civilizational logic. But we should question that. We should critique that, and we should preserve those kinds of order, those social forms, and try and replicate them in ways as far as we can in order to resist the encroachments of the state.
But don't you think there's a bit of a tension here, though, Ruth? I mean, I personally, I see a lot of like what you might call civilizational thinking in classical anarchist thought, and as as sensitive as people like Reclus and Kropotkin were to sort of non-state societies, I still think they had an idea of progress, and they understood that progress in civilizational terms. I mean, I think in Reclus has in one of the books like an actual like a sort of a schema, of like a mapping of civilization moving from like the fluvial to the oceanic and things like that. And yeah, I mean, they're obviously aware of the bumps on the road and things like that. But I think, don't consider the state to be a motor of progress. But I mean, can't you see this kind of like baggage in like things like the Manifesto of the 16, right? There's an investment in an Enlightenment idea of civilization and progress. That has its sort of political consequences in the 20th century.
Oh, I don't want to whitewash the anarchists and say, people are products of their time to a degree. I mean, one of the things that you find often, certainly in Reclus and in Kropotkin and Mechnikov, who was also part of the kind of the geography gang, is this sort of inheritance from Comte of the three stages, and this is replicated in a lot of their work. But I think the difference with the anarchists is that they don't map it to particular cultures. So not consistently, at least, not systematically. So and you do get in certainly in Kropotkin and Reclus an explicit rejection of the idea that Europe and the West are at the top of the stages. What you tend to find in them is that the top of the stages is anarchy. And now, to a greater or lesser degree, and Rocker gets wrapped up in that criticism too. They tend to associate anarchy with Western forms, but not exclusively. But, maybe they're reading the world through a Western lens. I mean, undoubtedly these things are true. I mean, you can't escape these kinds of prejudice, if you like, or norm. But did they think that Western civilization was superior? I'm not sure it's that clear cut. I think they're at least conscious of the fact that there is a narrative within within colonialism and within imperialism that suggests that Enlightenment comes from adopting Western practices, and in that respect, for me, they're absolutely opposed to that. They simply don't subscribe to it. So I think, even the Manifesto of the 16, I mean, what are they talking about? They're actually talking about a distinction within Europe. So for the Kropotkinites, civilization is threatened by the spread of, or by the Prussification of Europe. That's a civilizational problem. And why is it a civilizational problem? Well, because, my view is that, rightly or wrongly, and however sort of crude the analysis or faulty the analysis might have been, they saw in Prussia the exemplary state. And that if Prussia won, if Germany won, then that would become the model for the rest of Europe, and for Kropotkin, his obsession, for Russia. The one thing you didn't want to happen in Russia was that it would replicate the German model. And the only chance to enable Russia to reconstitute federation of multiple nations was to resist it. And he was wrong. He was proved wrong. But I think that's what he was about. So I don't think, when they use that kind of frame of civilization, they're thinking about the breakdown of powers within Europe. They're not talking about Europe and the colonies. But, of course, people make plenty of, I don't think that takes all anarchists off the hook in every way. That, no one is free of making bad calls but I don't see them. Fundamentally, I don't see the anarchists as being part of an ideology of Western progressivism. I simply don't see it.
Well, anyone who has frequented anarchist circles has doubtlessly heard the word utopian thrown about as an epithet. And in Chapter 4, you write pretty extensively about different currents of utopian thinking in anarchist theory and praxis, including anti-utopian utopians. And I've heard Kim Stanley Robinson, the writer and author, use the term anti-utopia, which accomplishes a sort of similar rhetorical double negative. And I'm really interested in this theory, and it animates a lot of my research. And so I was wondering, Ruth, if you could talk a little bit about this idea, this idea of anti-utopian utopians or anti-utopia, and why has it proven important for anarchist milieus?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, there's another way of thinking about it, which is utopian anti-utopianism. So you start off with the utopia. So if you don't have, if you don't have a theory, this comes back to the previous point in a way. If you don't have a theory of progression, if you don't have a theory of history, of a natural dynamic that's going to take you from one place to another, which for me is what anarchists. That's the absence, if you like, within anarchists. They don't have that that dynamic of change. Then you have a problem, one of motivation, and two of kind of feasibility, if you like, and possibility. So you're working in a real world which is structured by all kinds of institutions and power relationships that you don't like. And the question is, well, so, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to make it better? So you're kind of drawn as an anarchist, I think, to thinking about plans, what it might look like, how you might anarchize something, how you might undo some of the dominating forces that you're attacking. So that's one way of thinking about it. But at the same time, you can't, it comes back to the education point again. You can't tell people the best ways to live. They have to choose ways of living by themselves and through their own practices and through their own cooperation. So, you're working within this, again, this tension between what might something ideally look like in order to function in a particular way, in order to deliver particular kinds of services or to meet particular kinds of needs. How are you going to provide for well-being? What kinds of measures do you need to take if you want to transform a social order without, going through hardship, famine, the breakdown of all kinds of provision that enable people to live decent lives. So you have to have that. There's a certain amount of planning and thinking involved in that. And of course, as soon as you start to plan and think for today, you're inevitably thinking about, where's that going to go? How's that going to lead? And the other thing you're trying to work out is what's possible within the constraints that you currently face. We could sit here, and that one of the criticisms that the anarchists, the late 19th century anarchists had of so-called utopian socialists, was that it was a pretty pointless exercise to try and sit down and say, hey, look, ideal society looks like this, when actually capitalism was developing in particular ways that, one, were going to make it impossible, even if you thought that you could sell a desirable plan to everybody in the first place. So I think there's a utopianism in anarchism, which is about motivation and trying to overcome the deep skepticism people have about the practicality of social order without the state. and on the other hand, a way of denying a blueprint, if you like, the possibility of finding a perfection. And it's, you know, the criticism that anarchists have of mainstream constitutions and republicanism and liberalism is that that's precisely what they did, these people. You know, they sat down and they said, what's a liberal society going to be like? What's an egalitarian society going to be like? Oh, I tell you what, I can write it down and then we can build it. You know, and for the anarchists, that's a complete disaster, because as soon as you crystallize something in that way, you're building in a whole set of decisions and values and institutions that people themselves are not party to. They're not part of this. They're not involved in this. It's artificial. It's entirely artificial. It's abstract. So you can only build from below, but you have to build according to certain aspirations. And I guess that's where the utopianism comes in.
So I suppose this like last question builds on that, what you were just saying, Ruth, but maybe it's more about, like, I suppose your own like conclusions, because in the final paragraph of the book you state that the chances of anarchizing our social relationships and institutions are a lot higher than the likelihood of replacing the state with anarchy. So I was struck by this, and I wasn't sure exactly what you meant, because following the sort of the Landauer statement about the state as a social relationship, I kind of thought that one would entail the other. You know, if we anarchize our social relationships, then that's the state gone, right? So could you expand on the distinction that you're trying to make here?
It's partly a way of trying to get away from this thing called the state, which, you know, the state, I mean, what does it mean? It's a huge, complex concept. And, you know, we've already been talking about it, you know, so what does it mean in terms of people's understanding of monopoly or exploitation or racism, or, you know, any of these kinds of problem, you know. So on the one hand, I think the state becomes a shorthand for all kinds of different sorts of problems that we need to think about separately. We need to break down. And on the other hand, I think if you say to someone, anarchy is about abolishing the state, you know, that it seems so ridiculous, you know, that you know, come again. What on earth does it mean? How would you go about that? This is not just changing people's social relationships, is it? That seems to be saying you're going to be changing everything from the collection of the dustbins to electoral systems, you know, from welfare systems to schools, to all the things that people enjoy. I mean, it just makes it sound crazy. So if we think, so part of what I'm trying to say is, I'm not sure it's helpful to think about these really complex things in these shorthand ways. I don't think that helps anarchists particularly, and I don't think it helps people who are skeptical about anarchism get any greater sense of what it is anarchists actually want to do. So the other thing I guess I'm getting at, I mean, in terms of the actual distinction, is I don't think that anarchists do want to replace the state. So I don't think anarchists really want to do all that the state does. I think they want different kinds of social order. They don't want the same functionality. They don't want this monopoly. They don't want that kind of exercise of violence. They don't want necessarily to meet everybody's, you know, do you want welfare or do you want well-being? These are different kinds of things. One comes from care and community and cooperation. The other comes from dependence. And if you have dependent relationships, you have to have, you know, quite complex, expensive structures in order to deliver all this. Do we want to replace that? No, I don't think we want to replace it. We want to do something different. And I think until you then break down what it is you think the state is, you can't really think about what it is you want to do differently or how you want to do it differently. And it may be that different groups of people actually have different understandings of the kinds of social order that they want and come up with different sorts of responses. But just to say anarchists want to do, that does put you back in the kind of the framework of, well, anarchists are like Marxists, except they have different means. No, they don't want to capture the state in order to make it more to get rid of class power. They don't want to replicate the state. They don't want to replace it. They want to stop it because it continues to grow. And in order to do that, you have to fundamentally rethink your priorities and what it is you think that you can provide in order to realize well-being.
Is it almost like and I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I know we're kind of like towing this interesting line between anarchist kind of like theory and Marxist theory, but is the project of anarchizing our social relationships similar in theory to the idea of like the withering of the state, but less so like the withering of the state and more like making the state like obsolete? Like I've heard people use that type of terminology before, where like the state like and its structures and powers no longer matter. Is that kind of like what you're hinting at there, or is it something like different?
No. So my understanding of the withering away of the state is that the state loses its class function, right? So the state becomes the administration of things. So there's no reason to worry about class repression anymore, because there's only one class now, and the state as the instrument of the executive of the bourgeoisie, the instrument of class power, it's gone. But this is what Bakunin said, yeah. And so what happens to all those institutions? The military, the justice system, what happens to those? They're just run by a classless group. No, thank you. I don't want that. So anarchizing is, I suppose, a way of it's a term that I've taken from Armand, and I think it's a great term. The whole idea that it makes anarchy for me quite approachable, accessible. Because just as you can think about democratizing institutions or republicanizing institutions or feminizing institutions, you can anarchize them. And you can do that by, tackling the systems of domination that you see around you. And that might be simply in the way that you behave to other people. It might be the technique you use in a classroom. It might be the resistance to the technique you're told to use in the classroom. It may be in the way that you engage with local community organizations. It may be in the way that you organize local community organizations. There are all manner of things that, it might be in the information you produce, the way you disseminate it. These are things within our power and our control that we can anarchize.
Yeah, and I really like the term. I hadn't heard it before until I read the book. So thanks for introducing me to it. I really like it too, because it also jives with the idea that like anarchy is something you do, right? It's a verb. It's not just a noun, right? It can be, but it really is at its most potent and salient when it is active, when it's something that you do, rather than something that you are. And I really like that idea about the language of anarchization, or anarchizing. But yeah, I digress. Before we part ways, let's just go around real quick and let people know where they can like check out our work, pick up our book, that sort of thing. So Ruth, why don't you start? Where can listeners find your book, The Government of No One, or your other work?
So The Government of No One is readily available in mainstream bookstores, but you can also find it in most good radical independent booksellers. You can access a lot of most all my work that's not owned by a publisher through the Loughborough University repository, and you can find a lot of it online. You can find other recent work on Dog Section Press's site, all free and accessible.
Beautiful. Danny and Jim, where can folks go to listen to ABC with Danny and Jim?
Well, any good podcast app, you should find ABC with Danny and Jim. We've managed somehow to create a relatively niche enough name that we're quite searchable. You can also find us on Twitter at ABC Danny and Jim. The same on Facebook. And we have an email, which is abcwithdannyandjim@gmail.com.
Beautiful. And if you guys are listening to this episode of the podcast in ABC's podcast feed, you can find Coffee with Comrades wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us online at www.coffeewithcomrades.com. We're on Instagram and Twitter. We have a Patreon, all that bullshit. But yeah, this has been a lovely conversation, y'all. I really appreciate getting to bounce these ideas around with y'all and, think through these ideas. Ruth, thank you so much for agreeing to come on. Originally, we had just kind of like floated the idea of just having, a conversation amongst ourselves. And then we were like, oh, wait, we should just message Ruth and ask if she wants to join us. So, I'm glad that we were able to make that happen. I think it was a cool little dialogue that we had. So thanks, y'all.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
For sure.
Yeah,
likewise.
Yeah, and thanks very much, Pearson, and thanks, Ruth. I think that line from Kropotkin, life and mutual aid, or the state and death, is one that's going to stay with me, I think.
Yeah. Fuck yeah, that's a good note to go out on. All right, y'all. Well, be well. Solidarity to each of you.
Yeah, you too. Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
And that about does it for this week's episode of Coffee with Comrades. This is an entirely DIY show run by workers for workers. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades and Instagram at CoffeeWithComrades. Check out our website, www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and sign up to support our work with a monthly contribution by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. You can find Coffee with Comrades on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you go to get your anti-capitalist propaganda. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. While you're there, smashing that subscribe button, be sure to rate and review the show as well to help us increase our reach. If you have feedback, criticism, or you'd just like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email at coffeewithcomrades@gmail.com. Until next time, stay wild out there.